Over 1,100 people died when a factory collapsed in Bangladesh. The world called it exploitation. Brands vowed to reform. Consumers demanded change. And yet, a decade later, the same system still exists. Why? Because the economics behind fast fashion are way more complicated than most people realize. Millions of workers continue to choose these jobs. Companies continue to outsource production. And consumers continue to demand cheaper and cheaper clothing. So if nearly everyone involved benefits from the system in some way, why is fast fashion still viewed as exploitative? To answer that, you have to understand the incentives holding the entire industry together. The entire goal of fast fashion is strikingly simple. The aim is to maximize speed while simultaneously minimizing costs. In order to do this, many fashion brands started shifting their manufacturing operations to countries like China or Bangladesh, where labor is significantly cheaper. At the same time, large improvements in containerized shipping and air freight made it possible to move products across the world faster and more efficiently than ever before. The combination of lower prices and faster shipping caused a fashion boom unlike anything seen before. By the 1990s, fashion companies were facing increasing pressure to lower prices while producing more styles at an even faster pace. Product life cycles became shorter, trends started to change extremely rapidly, and consumers began expecting constant variety at extremely low prices. This, in turn, created fast fashion as we know it today. A global supply chain optimized around speed, cost reduction, and non-stop consumer demand. The major players within this system include international fashion brands, factory owners, workers, and the governments responsible for the implementation of labor regulations. Each of these players has their own set of incentives that determine their actions. Workers want the highest paying job available. Factory owners want contracts and profits. Brands want lower costs and faster production. Consumers want trendy clothing at low prices. And governments want investment and employment. None of these incentives are irrational, but together they create a system that can produce outcomes that almost nobody explicitly wants. And while these supply chains are incredibly economically efficient, they have also become highly controversial. To understand why this system is so difficult to change, let's follow a single $10 t-shirt. At first glance, it seems obvious who benefits. The factory worker who stitched the shirt is paid very little, while the brand sells it for $10. But the reality is much more complicated. The price of that shirt has to cover raw materials, transportation across the world, factory operations, warehouses, marketing campaigns, retail stores, online infrastructure, and the salaries of thousands of employees who never set foot inside a factory. By the time every cost is accounted for, the workers' wages make up only a small fraction of the final price. This $10 t-shirt reveals an extremely important economic reality. That is, that no single participant captures all of the value. Instead, every participant, from consumers looking for low prices, to brands competing on cost, to governments competing for investment, is responding to incentives created by the system itself. When people think of fast fashion factories, often referred to as sweatshops, They usually think of unsafe working conditions, low wages, long hours, and child labor. Tragedies such as the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013 brought global attention to these issues and intensified criticism of the industry. Many people describe these conditions as exploitative, but defining exploitation becomes more complicated than it initially seems. To understand why, we first have to answer a surprisingly difficult question. What exactly counts as exploitation? For the purposes of this video, I will be using the Stanford Encyclopedia definition, where they define structural exploitation as a system where the rules unfairly benefit one group to the detriment of another. And this is where the debate becomes difficult. Because despite the harsh conditions often associated with sweatshops, many workers voluntarily choose these jobs because the alternatives available to them are even worse. Economist Benjamin Powell found that workers in many export factories earn significantly more than the average income in their countries. Although, a critic would argue that comparing factory wages to national averages can obscure regional cost of living and poor working conditions. That doesn't mean that sweatshops are the ideal form of employment, but it does complicate the idea that sweatshop labor is simply forced exploitation. For many workers, factory labor represents one of the very best economic opportunities available for them within their local economy. The biggest drivers behind modern fast fashion are global wage disparities, weak labor regulations, and constant consumer demand for cheaper clothing. Much of this demand is driven by what is often called throwaway culture. As of 2021, consumers were buying 60% more clothing items on an annual basis than they were 15 years prior. Yet, on average, they only keep each item for half as long. There are also some psychological factors at play. For instance, people naturally want to fit in, and clothing has become one of the easiest ways to signal identity and belonging. The boom of social media has accelerated these trend cycles dramatically. Social media platforms such as TikTok and Instagram are constantly pushing new aesthetics, outfits, and micro trends. Clothing has become increasingly tied to online identity and social acceptance. These ties incentivize the consumer to buy more while wearing it for shorter periods of time. 50 years ago, clothing trends changed seasonally. Today, a trend can emerge on TikTok, peak in 2 weeks, and disappear before the month is even over. Fast fashion isn't simply responding to demand. It has evolved alongside an entirely new culture of constant consumption. When companies are competing almost entirely on price and speed, that pressure gets pushed down the supply chain. Manufacturers are expected to produce clothing faster and cheaper, which then creates incentives to cut corners on safety and working conditions. And because many workers face structural inequalities like poverty, lack of education, and limited job opportunities, factory work often becomes the most viable option available. This creates a difficult reality. The labor is technically voluntary, but the choices available to workers are heavily constrained by their economic environment. At the same time, these factories can still contribute significantly to economic development. Historically, many industrialized economies, including the United States, the UK, and China, have experienced similar stages of industrialization involving harsh factory labor conditions. During the Industrial Revolution, factories in Britain employed children, required 14-hour workdays and operated in dangerous conditions. Yet, over time, economic growth, rising wages, labor organization, and regulation dramatically improved those conditions. Some economists would argue that today's developing economies may be following a similar path. That does not justify unsafe work environments, but it does show that industrial labor has historically played a pivotal role in economic growth. After the Rana Plaza collapse, labor organizations and international groups created a binding agreement known as the Accord. The agreement imposed safety standards across factories in Bangladesh and later expanded into Pakistan. The Accord improved safety conditions for millions of workers and eliminated tens of thousands of factory hazards. But even these reforms reveal another hidden incentive problem. If regulations increase costs too aggressively in one country, companies may simply move manufacturing elsewhere in search of cheaper production. Many governments are hesitant to impose aggressive regulations because the garment industry plays a major role in their economy. If manufacturing leaves, thousands of workers could lose jobs basically overnight. At the same time, pressure for lower prices pushes suppliers to cut corners. When operating on razor-thin margins, businesses prioritize speed and limit safety measures due to cost. These actions inherently increase risk for their workers. These factors create what's often called a race to the bottom. This is when countries compete to offer the lowest production costs in order to attract business investment. As a result, improving labor conditions becomes a balancing act. Protect workers too little, and conditions remain dangerous. Protect workers too aggressively, and companies may relocate entirely. A good example of a race to the bottom is happening in China. For a long time, China was the main exporter of clothing and shoes to the EU. As wages in China increased, many fashion brands shifted production toward countries with lower labor costs, like Bangladesh and Vietnam. This creates a powerful incentive problem. If one country becomes too expensive, companies can often just pack up and move production elsewhere, taking their jobs and economic prosperity with them. There is also the 2021 study conducted by Ryo Makioka, which examines the impact of anti-sweatshop activism by looking at Indonesian sweatshop wages from the 1990s. Using a synthetic control methodology in order to account for all differences in his treatment and control groups, observable or not, Makioka found that as the spread of anti-sweatshop ideas swept through these factories, minimum wage compliance went up, leading to a roughly 30% drop in sweatshop employment. Humans will always respond to incentives. When labor costs rise, companies will either pare down their staff or relocate entirely, leaving many people with no other option than the lesser alternative that they were already avoiding. It's easy to blame brands, it's easy to blame consumers, it's easy to blame governments. But fast fashion persists because every participant responds to the incentives in front of them. Workers seek better opportunities, companies seek lower costs, consumers seek lower prices, and governments seek economic growth. Changing the system means changing those incentives, not simply identifying someone to blame. If banning sweatshops eliminates jobs that workers voluntarily choose, but leaving them unchanged exposes millions of people to dangerous conditions, then what does ethical reform actually look like?